They called her the Queen of Two Kingdoms, yet history remembers Eleanor of Aquitaine as a prisoner upon her own throne. She wore the crowns of both France and England, but each crown came bound with chains, the chains of family, of the church, and of men who trembled before the brilliance of her light. In an age when women were little more than pawns of marriage, Eleanor entered Paris like a flame, daring to consume everything in its path. She was praised, but also cursed in hushed voices, whispered about as a new Eve who might drag an entire dynasty to ruin. This is not just the story of a queen. It is history's living paradox. Eleanor, the woman who held unimaginable power, yet carried within her heart shackles no one could break. Before we begin, if you love stories of history filled with tragedy and power, make sure to hit subscribe so you won't miss a single journey. Aquitaine, the name itself lingers in the air like a song carried by the wind, a land of wine, of sun-drenched castles along the Dordogne. In the 12th century, it was not just a duchy, but a world apart, far removed from the austere courts of the north. Here, lyric poetry flourished, troubadours sang of love and longing, and women were not merely ornaments, but wielders of destiny. It was in this atmosphere that Eleanor grew up, a young girl nurtured on freedom, music, and power. Her father, Duke William X, was a man of great force, known as much for his charm as for his wild excesses. To his daughter, he left a vast inheritance stretching from the Atlantic to the Pyrenees, one of the richest lands in all of Europe. When William died on a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, Eleanor was only 15. Yet, in that moment of grief, she was no longer just an orphaned child. She had become the most powerful heiress in Western Europe. They say that when news of William's death reached Poitiers, the southern court trembled. A girl of 15 now held a realm long coveted by northern kings. And Eleanor, instead of shrinking in fear, appeared before the crowd at the funeral with proud eyes and resplendent dress, as though ready to step into the role destiny had prepared for her. Some historians believe it was in that very moment the image of the Lady of Aquitaine was born, a figure at once alluring and formidable. But power always draws peril. Young, dazzlingly beautiful, and richer than any noble alive, Eleanor's very existence was a target. Plots swirled to abduct her, to seize her duchy through force. William, perhaps foreseeing this, had left a peculiar will. Eleanor was placed under the guardianship of King Louis VI of France, who would decide her husband. Within months, she was betrothed to his son, Louis II, a pious, ascetic young man, her complete opposite. Eleanor left Aquitaine, carrying with her the fragrance and music of the South into the cold North. On the road to Paris, people flocked to glimpse the future queen. They said she rode with unshakable poise, her gold-embroidered cloak billowing in the wind, followed by a retinue more splendid than anything the Northerners had seen. To them, she seemed like a vision, an unfamiliar breeze sweeping across a darkened land. But beauty and freedom always come with a price. Paris of the 12th century was a city of austerity, ruled by the hand of the church. Louis VII, her husband, was a man so devoted to religion that he shunned earthly pleasures altogether. And Eleanor, from the first days she stepped into the palace, felt an icy chill, not of weather, but of suspicious eyes. Whispers began to spread. Eleanor was too lavish, too unrestrained. Some historians claim she brought with her forbidden church customs, courts where knights praised romantic love rather than mere loyalty to God. To the clergy, this was dangerous, a spark threatening to burn down the order they had so carefully built. Yet amid the scrutiny, Eleanor stood unbowed, carrying the spirit of Aquitaine within her. She was not timid like other queens. She spoke her mind in council, took part in decisions, and often bent Louis VI to her will. This made her admired by some, but to others she was a trespasser, a dangerous anomaly. Her freedom, her radiance, so bright with the southern sun, planted the seeds of future tragedy. For in a devout conservative court, a woman who dared to live too boldly, too brilliantly, would soon be branded a rebel. And so the shadows began to gather around Eleanor, foreshadowing the years of rumor, scandal, and betrayal that lay ahead. The palace in Paris, with its cold gray stone walls and endless maze-like corridors, was the stage where Eleanor was forced to play the role of Queen of France. To the outside world, her marriage to Louis VII was hailed as a grand union, a wealthy duchy joined with a powerful crown. But inside it was a binding full of contradictions, an untamed, spirited young woman trapped in the arms of a king who lived more like a monk than a monarch. Louis II was no tyrant. He was gentle, devout, almost innocent in his piety. Yet that very austerity made Eleanor a stranger within her own marriage. She, who had grown up with the vibrant celebrations of Poitiers, now found herself suffocated by endless prayers and meager meals. The young bride arrived draped in brilliant fabrics and sparkling jewels, only to be met with whispers from priests who warned that such extravagance was nothing but a mark of sin. Eleanor did not bother to hide her discontent. At feasts, she spoke her mind openly, often overshadowing Louis. Some accounts suggest she even sat beside him in council meetings, an act without precedent. She offered opinions on matters of state and war, and more than once, her words swayed the hesitant king. To the northern nobility, this was both intoxicating and unsettling. A young queen daring to step into the world of men. It is said that during a dispute over contested lands, Eleanor boldly rebuked her husband's advisors in front of the entire court. Her words cut sharp and fast, silencing the chamber. Louis, flustered, eventually sided with her. To many, it was proof she had gone too far. To Eleanor, it was simply the natural right of a ruler. But under the scrutiny of the court, rumors began to spread. They said she was arrogant, that she pulled Louis' strings like a puppet. Some historians believe it was precisely the contrast between them, the radiant woman and the pallid king, that first birthed whispers of the danger Eleanor carried within her. The conflict ran deeper than politics. It reached into her heart. Eleanor longed for a love of equals, but Louis bent only before God. He loved her with ascetic devotion, while she craved adventure, the romantic songs of troubadours once sung beneath her windows in Poitiers. Night after night, within the chill of those stone walls, Eleanor realized that the French crown, however glittering, was nothing more than a gilded chain. When she bore her first child, a daughter, the court offered congratulations, but their disappointment could not be hidden. They wanted a prince, an heir. Instead of being celebrated, Eleanor became a target for blame. She was accused of bringing only vanity and unrest, unable to secure the dynasty's future. Soon whispers grew. The marriage had been a mistake, and Aquitaine was worth far more than the woman who had delivered it to Paris. These rumors, layered over a strained marriage, left Eleanor increasingly isolated. In those frigid corridors, she was like a fire smothered under stone, brilliant but starved of air. Many historians believe that even in those early years of queenship, she began plotting her escape. For if she remained merely a bride, she would be consumed. But if she were to be a sovereign, she would need to shatter the walls that confined her. And from this stifling marriage, Eleanor's first great scandal was about to ignite, in a journey she thought would prove her worth, the Crusade. When the Pope called for the Second Crusade, Eleanor saw in it not only a holy mission, but also a chance to escape the cold, confining walls of Paris. She longed for adventure, for freedom, for the thrill of leading. And this time, she would ride alongside her husband, Louis VII, across Europe, across the sea, toward the Holy Land. But instead of glory, the journey etched into her life wounds that would never heal, and a storm of scandal that history would never stop whispering about. The French army departed in 1147. Eleanor did not remain hidden away in the royal quarters. She donned light armor and led a retinue of Aquitanian nobles, including women. Ladies who rode as knights and carried bows. Chronicles say her company looked like something out of a song, a dazzling procession of riders that left the crowds astonished. Some accounts even claim she roused the soldiers' spirits with fiery speeches. But the sight of a queen on horseback, commanding like a leader, also stirred a quiet fury among northern clergy and nobles. The crusade quickly turned into a nightmare. The French forces were ambushed, starved, plagued by sickness. Eleanor, with her unyielding spirit, often intervened in matters of strategy. It is said she opposed the treacherous march through Asia Minor, yet Louis and his generals ignored her, leading to thousands of needless deaths. For many, Eleanor became the perfect scapegoat, a woman daring to meddle in war, and therefore the reason for defeat. When the army reached Antioch, the true scandal began. The city was ruled by Raymond, Eleanor's uncle, a charming, brilliant prince with a magnetic presence. In the midst of a failing campaign, Raymond welcomed Eleanor warmly. Within Antioch's blazing feasts, filled with exotic scents, music, and oil lamps, Eleanor found a spark of freedom. Some historians believe she grew too close to Raymond, not merely as niece and uncle, but as two kindred souls. Rumors spread like wildfire. Eleanor had betrayed Louis, that she and Raymond shared a forbidden bond. The truth remains forever shrouded. Perhaps it was intimacy, perhaps forbidden love, or perhaps nothing but slander. Yet Louis believed the whispers, and the French court began to fracture. It is said that when Louis prepared to leave Antioch, Eleanor openly defied him, declaring she would stay with Raymond. For a queen to publicly announce her intent to abandon her husband, it was a shock beyond words. In the end, Louis had her dragged away like a prisoner, returned to the army in heavy silence. From that moment on, their marriage was nothing but an empty shell. The crusade ended in disaster. But the greatest infamy did not fall on Louis. It fell on Eleanor. She returned to France bearing poisonous rumors that she was the woman of Antioch, that her stubbornness and desires had provoked God's wrath, dooming the army. Clerics wrote that Eleanor was Eve incarnate, the temptress who led mankind into ruin. Yet beneath the mud of scandal, a truth still glimmered. Eleanor would no longer accept life as a queen trapped in the shadows. She had dared to love, dared to resist, dared to break the mold the world forced upon her. And from the ashes of the crusade, she began to nurture the idea of freeing herself from her marriage to Louis, a union born of politics, but dying in silence and disdain. The rumors, the failures, the bitter quarrels, all of it became the dark prelude to Eleanor's great turning point, divorcing a king and stepping into the arms of a man far more ambitious, dangerous, and ruthless, Henry Plantagenet. When Eleanor returned to France after the crusade, her marriage with Louis VII was little more than a hollow shell. They could be seen seated together at ceremonies, yet their eyes never met, their hands never touched. They had 2 daughters, but the court yearned for a male heir, and that disappointment became the perfect excuse for the church to support an annulment. Some historians believe it was Eleanor herself who pushed for the separation, wielding scandal like a blade to sever her bond with Paris. In 1152, the marriage was dissolved. Eleanor, now past 30, reclaimed her title as Duchess of Aquitaine, but she knew all too well. A wealthy, independent woman alone in a Europe filled with wolves would never be safe. Predators, nobles, and brigands alike hungered for her lands and power. At least 2 attempts were made to abduct her on her journey back to Poitiers. It is said she had to travel swiftly, changing horses constantly, for enemies lurked at every turn. But Eleanor was no prey. She had her eyes set on a new alliance, bold, dangerous, and one that would reshape the map of Europe. Just 8 weeks after her marriage to Louis II was annulled, Eleanor wed again. Her choice was no stranger. Henry Plantagenet, the young Duke of Normandy and Anjou, a man burning with ambition and a hunger for the English crown. This marriage struck Europe like a thunderclap. Louis VII, her former husband, suddenly found himself surrounded. His ex-wife was now the consort of his enemy, a man far more powerful and ruthless than himself. It is said Louis was so enraged that he marched his army against Henry, only to be utterly humiliated in defeat. The cruel irony, the woman he had sought to cast aside had become the greatest threat to his throne. For Eleanor, this was more than a marriage. It was a wager with life and death at stake. Henry was nearly 11 years her junior, but between them existed a strange harmony. He brought strength, she brought cunning. When Henry ascended the English throne in 1154, Eleanor became queen. And unlike Louis, Henry did not want a wife merely to bear him children. He needed a political ally, someone capable of helping him govern a realm stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. In those first years, Eleanor shone brighter than ever. She bore Henry 8 children, among them future kings Richard the Lionheart and John Lackland. She ruled Aquitaine, turning it into a beacon of poetry and culture, nurturing the chivalric spirit and the ideals of love that would later spread across Europe. Some historians call this Eleanor's golden reign, when she was queen, mother, and patron of a radiant cultural age. But every light casts a shadow. Henry, though he needed Eleanor, grew fearful of her immense influence. He was notorious for his temper, his lust, his brazen display of mistresses. Eleanor, meanwhile, clashed with him more and more, over governance, over the loyalty of their sons, and over her own freedom. Records suggest that she withdrew to Poitiers, where she presided over courts of love, gatherings in which knights and ladies debated the nature of passion, an act both artistic and audacious, even perilous. What began as a marriage that seemed the pinnacle of power began to fracture. And from those cracks, tragedy spread. Eleanor and Henry's sons, raised in the fever of ambition, would soon turn the family into a battlefield, forcing Eleanor to choose sides, betray her husband, and suffer a brutal punishment. From this moment on, Eleanor's life veered into a path drenched in blood and betrayal. The sons she had borne for Henry II refused to remain under the shadow of their domineering father. Henry hoarded power for himself, clinging to the most precious lands while granting his sons only meager scraps of territory, mere tokens of authority. But Eleanor's blood, the proud lineage of Aquitaine, ran through their veins. And from their mother, they had learned one lesson above all. Power is never won through patience alone. In 1173, the revolt of the young princes erupted. Henry the young king, Richard, and Geoffrey, three of Eleanor's sons with Henry, turned against their father. Whispers spread that Eleanor herself had fueled their rebellion, secretly sending messages and guiding their defiance. Perhaps she believed the time had come for her husband to share power. Or perhaps she wished to see Richard, the son she cherished most, crowned as a true sovereign of Aquitaine, not merely a ruler in name. Henry II's fury was that of a wounded lion. He crushed the uprising without mercy. Geoffrey was driven back. Henry the young king was forced to yield. And Richard, the proud young warrior, was subdued by both his father's sword and his iron will. Yet it was not the sons who paid the heaviest price. It was Eleanor. When Henry discovered her hand in the rebellion, he saw it as an unforgivable betrayal. The woman who had once been his ally was now a threat within his own household. In 1174, Eleanor was captured while traveling back to Poitiers. She was taken across the Channel to England, not as a queen, but as a prisoner. For nearly 16 years, Eleanor lived in captivity, not in a dungeon, but confined within formidable castles, cut off from the world, from Aquitaine, and from the sons she had raised to be kings. It was said she was only allowed to appear on rare occasions, such as Christmas feasts, seated beside her husband, but always under guard. The world gradually forgot her, or pretended to. A queen who had once ruled over two of Europe's greatest realms had been reduced to a shadow, walled in by stone. Yet even in silence, Eleanor did not break. She watched, she waited, and she held fast to the belief that her destiny was not finished. Her chance came at last. In 1189, Henry II died. Richard, Eleanor's beloved son, ascended the throne as Richard the Lionheart, one of England's most legendary kings, and in that instant, Eleanor's chains were lifted. She emerged from captivity not as a weird, but as a resurrected force of power. Richard needed her. In the early years of his reign, his focus lay on the Crusades, leaving England vulnerable to chaos. Eleanor became regent, ruling in his stead. She wrote letters, issued decrees, levied taxes, and settled disputes with the unflinching hand of a woman seasoned by betrayal, war, and imprisonment. Many at court would later admit it was Eleanor who kept England from collapse during Richard's absence. But fate had not finished testing her. When Richard was captured in Austria on his return from the Crusades, Eleanor, now nearly 70, led the campaign to ransom her son. She traveled tirelessly across Europe, negotiating and gathering the enormous sum demanded, a ransom so vast it nearly bled her people dry. Chroniclers tell of Eleanor, frail in body yet burning with resolve, standing in the German court, not as a broken old woman, but as an indomitable queen demanding the release of her child, and she succeeded. Richard was freed, yet time could not be conquered. When Richard died in 1199, the crown passed to John, the youngest son, remembered to history as John Lackland, a weak and disastrous king. Even then, Eleanor did not withdraw. She defended Aquitaine, arranged alliances, and fought to preserve peace in a Europe torn by feudal wars. But her strength was ebbing. After more than 80 years at the crossroads of crowns and chains, Eleanor retired to the Abbey of Fontevraud. There, within the stillness of its stone walls, she awaited the end. Not as a queen, not as a prisoner, but as a woman who had lived through the full circle of power and betrayal. Inside Fontevraud, shadow and light live side by side. Eleanor, now an old woman, moves slowly beneath the cold stone vaults, where the echo of prayers drifts upward like thin smoke. Her entire life had been swept into the storm of power. And now, at 80, she sits in silence, listening to the whispers of the centuries. Most remember her as Queen of Two Kingdoms, wife of two kings, mother of warriors. But in Fontevraud, Eleanor is no longer a symbol of politics. She is an old woman who has loved and betrayed, who has built and destroyed, who once set Europe ablaze with her ambition. The wounds of her soul remain: imprisonment, betrayal, children lost too soon, dreams reduced to ash. Some say that in her final days she turned devout, seeking redemption in prayer. Yet others believe Eleanor never truly bent to God or to any man. The effigy carved upon her tomb, a book resting in her hands, feels like her final declaration. She chose knowledge as her weapon, wisdom as her eternal companion. Eleanor's legacy is a paradox. She was both betrayer and protector. She drove her sons into war, yet fought to free them from chains. She defied the boundaries placed upon women, yet history recast her into a figure of scandal. They called her cunning, ruthless, shameless in love. But those very labels reveal how fiercely she broke the mold of the medieval woman. She would not stand still. She would not be erased. She died in 1204, leaving a hollow space in both realms. Aquitaine, once her glittering dominion, slowly slipped into other hands. Yet Eleanor's name endured. She haunted ballads, lingered in tales of knights and love, etched herself into the memories of those who despised her as much as they admired her. Imagine it, a woman who walked through 8 decades of the Middle Ages, leaving her imprint upon the throne of France, the throne of England, and in the hearts of children forged from fire and steel. There was no one like her, and after her, no one could ever embody such power again. Eleanor's legacy still echoes like a mournful song, where power walks with solitude, where love is braided with betrayal, where victory is only another mask for loss. Perhaps that is why Eleanor of Aquitaine endures as one of history's most haunting ghosts, unforgettable, unforgiven, and utterly irreplaceable. A woman who turned her life into the longest, fiercest, and most tragic drama medieval Europe had ever seen.